Massive welcome, everybody, and something I didn't really deep down believe I'd ever see, which is a crowded deal theatre full of behavioural science enthusiasts. Just a little, housekeeping reminder that mobile phones can, of course, be on. There's extraordinarily good broadband, courtesy of the fibre optic cabinet just outside the building. But if you can put phones on silent, that's a great plus. This is basically part of our probably valiant, but certainly heroic, possibly failed attempt to make deal to behavioural science what Hay on Wye is to second-hand books, or Palermo is to organised crime, effectively. Which is to create a little centre. There is a slight reason for it. Paul Craven, formerly of Goldman Sachs, now of Craven Partners, great behavioural finance expert, and I both have, he has a house because he used to work for Goldman Sachs, and I have a flat because I work in the advertising industry. But we both have second homes and spend a lot of time down here. I also decided to buy a flat down here on behavioural science principles, which is that very simple thing observed by Dan Ariely, that when we make any journey, we disproportionately hate travelling in a direction against the direction of ultimate travel. So heading to Heathrow to fly to Paris is just more disheartening than driving east to fly to Paris. And I realised that since nearly all the roads out of London lead north or west or southwest, there's an insane bias among prosperous Londoners to basically get on the A3 and keep on going to places like Dorset and Devon and so forth. Whereas by contrast, in order to get down to the East Kent coast, you actually have to do a dog leg on the M25, which is against our innate instincts. So I realized that this place is actually effectively underexploited simply because of that. So it was the obvious place to exploit behavioral biases by actually buying undervalued property. And sure enough, indeed, East Kent is the only place in southern England where average property prices are less than 5 times average earnings. So not that I'm trying to drive the price up or anything here. But do spend a bit of time exploring the town. It has the Daily Telegraph's High Street of the Year, which was a competition to actually explore really successful high streets that are actually being revitalised and not exclusively dominated just by chains or charity shops. And this is a very good example. An extraordinary seafront, a street called Middle Street, which is as great a collection of architecture as you'll ever find. And it's truly a magical place. If you have a bit of spare time before the coach goes, then please do explore. The purpose of the day, as you'll see, it's a fairly varied day, but with the most important thing being a really, really good balance of theory and practice. And that, if you like, is my single aim, really, for this event, which is to forge really useful and symbiotic links between theoreticians and practitioners in the area of behavioural science, marketing, indeed, things like, related things such as economics. And the reason, very simply, is if you go back to the early episodes of Mad Men, this is in the first season, what you will notice is back then there were strange psychologists, usually with bow ties and fake Viennese accents, rumbling around the agency and occasionally contributing some of their insights to advertising and marketing. So Plink Plink Fizz for Alka-Seltzer was a deliberate attempt to create a norm around using 2 Alka-Seltzer rather than 1. It was the second Plink that was the point of that. Clearly, in those early days, people actually, maybe instinctively, knew rather a lot. I've made this point elsewhere, which is, how else can a month's salary last a lifetime, which was an advertisement for De Beers engagement rings, was a very, very clever attempt to establish a price anchor, for example. Some of the work later done that actually people are more comfortable making a decision if they know there's a stated trade-off, for example. That actually, I think there's work done by Robert Cialdini, which shows that one of the most successful sales techniques is to admit a small weakness before the strength. Now, the advertising industry had discovered that years before with lines like reassuringly expensive for Stella Artois, and indeed a line written by Salman Rushdie when he worked at Ogilvy as a copywriter before he decided to squander his talent by writing Midnight's Children, which was when he wrote the line, "Fresh cream cakes, naughty but nice." One of his better pieces, I think. But we knew this stuff instinctively as practitioners, and this is how it often happens. Actually, George may point this out a bit. Practitioners, in many cases, are actually quite far ahead because by accident they stumble on very valuable discoveries. And I would contend that actually within just consumer marketing. There are huge behavioural science discoveries yet to be made by the people who first spot them and codify them. I genuinely think there are, you can treat, in many ways, consumer markets a bit like the Galapagos Islands. Go out there and look for peculiarities and oddities, spot the significance of those things, and then what we've failed to do as practitioners, and what practitioners always fail to do, is having made the discovery, to actually codify it, make sense of it, and therefore see how it's applicable to something else. I knew in the late 80s, I discovered this strange phenomenon with American Express direct mail letters, which is you do something very small, like change the order of the application form, and response rates would occasionally double or go up by 50%. It defied all economic logic. I knew there was something there, and I thought this is patently something worth studying because the effects here are immense. But what practitioners always do is they move on to the next thing, rather than sitting back and saying, is there actually a whole science around this that we should be developing? And this is why I think that the symbiotic relationship between academic practitioners in these fields and practical practitioners, we can be actually an extraordinary source of insights and potential theory. They can, in turn, actually codify the theory, mathematicize it, argue what its limitations might be, what its predictive value might be, and where there are exceptions. And if we can, in the UK, be better at forging these links than anybody else, then I genuinely think the economic benefits are absolutely immense, and also the social benefits as well. So that's more or less all I have to say, that if we can, what you will find, however, is that, this isn't just about behavioural economics, pure and simple. Our first speaker, Armand Leroy, is actually a professor of evolutionary systems and evolutionary biology. What we also need to do, and this is just an important final point, is we need to extend our interest, not only quite rightly to those behavioural science and behavioural economics practitioners who are particularly valuable to us. What we also need to do is just explore a little wider in the field of both the decision sciences and, most important of all, in economics. And George Cooper, who's also speaking later, is a fascinating dissident economist who's also an expert on the works of someone called Kuhn, who makes the point about how theories take hold and can be incredibly difficult to dislodge. And so if you wonder occasionally, that's strange, why are we now talking about sort of dissident theories in economics? I'll explain in very simple terms, okay? One of the interesting things which I discovered when I started reading about behavioural economics was that most economic models depend on the assumption that everybody in a transaction has perfect information and perfect trust. Okay? Now, in reality, that exists somewhere between very, very rarely and never. The only problem is that most people, I would argue, in finance, many people who come out of business schools, unconsciously lean back on this simple Econ 101 model of how a market should work. The problem you have there is, if you assume perfect information and perfect trust, you've just assumed a world where marketing needn't and shouldn't exist. So if you want to understand why we occasionally, as marketers, have problems dealing with people who just don't seem to see the world the way we do, take a bit of heart, because increasingly in the better ranks and in the better areas of economics, there are similarly economists who actually surprisingly do see the world the way we do and think the people we're arguing with are sometimes wrong. So that's me, more or less, until the panel session and my peer review, which is a PIER review at the end of the day. I'd just like to say thank you immensely for coming, first of all. I think how many people want to make this annual? Just as a commitment device, come on. There we are. Excellent consistency bias. Good, marvellous. Got you to raise your hand, all done. I'd just like to say just immense thanks for coming, that this day will be extraordinary. It may be confusing at times, it will never be dull. Just like to say thank you very much and introduce our first speaker, Professor Armand Leroy, who is talking about the evolution of the Billboard 100 and evolutionary thinking applied to culture, which is, I think, too fascinating to miss. Thank you very much indeed.